What's up, everybody? This is Professor Keegan, and I'm coming to you with a video providing some frameworks for your reading of Angela Davis's book, Are Prisons Obsolete? We're kind of looking at the majority of this book over 3 classes, and then we're pairing it with a video that I'm going to have you watch for our next synchronous class, a documentary called 13th. By Ava DuVernay about the history of the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration in the United States. So the purpose of this video is to give you some framing kind of concepts for how to engage this material, and then also to update you a bit in terms of some of the statistics that are offered in the Davis book, because that book is over 10 years old at this point. So how have things moved since Davis was assessing the situation in the United States in the early 2000s? So I'm starting you out with this image, which is an image of, I think, 200 prison facilities in the United States or something like that. The prison as an institution takes up a massive amount of geographic space in our country. And we don't often think about how much of the land that was taken from indigenous peoples now is used to keep people in cages, kind of away from society. So, thinking about how land is still a factor here is something I wanted to touch down on. So we are in this unit about prisons called Unlearning Myths of Incarceration or Mass Incarceration. And we really are heading towards some of the strongest frames in American culture at this point. We've looked at race, which is a very strong frame. We've talked about the major frames dictating people's sort of racial attitudes in the United States. And now we're looking at one of the institutions we've created to manage the relationships between white people and people of color, which is the prison industry. Prisons are deeply, deeply naturalized in US culture. We're taught that they simply must exist. One of the things we're going to try to do in class is really question that position. Like, are prisons necessary? What effects do they actually have? And what are some of the major myths surrounding them that we've been taught that we might need to unlearn or think more critically about? So this will just be a bit of framing for your reading of Davis. Her book is called Are Prisons Obsolete? And I just want to update you a bit on where the facts have gone since 2003. So currently in the United States, about 1 in 100 US adults is incarcerated. So that is a massive number of people. I think we don't often think about how many people are actually in some form of incarceration in the United States. But I often in this course have students share whether they know someone or know someone who knows someone who's been incarcerated, and usually more than half of the class raises their hands. So this is something that impacts people very directly and very personally in ways that we don't talk about and don't think critically about. Like, why is this happening? We have seen a 500% increase in the prison population in the United States since 1980. We could think about why that might be. Are Americans just 500% more criminal than we were in 1980? Or does this have something to do with the intensification of felony class crimes, policing of communities in those super aggressive ways that we've kind of touched on a bit in class, the drug war, right? All the things that we've created that have grown prisons a shocking amount in just 3 decades in ways that we haven't really grappled with as a culture. And then, of course, the problem that although people of color only make up about 35% of the US population, they are 50% overrepresented in the prison population. So we do know that people of color, because of all the ways that policing and laws have been implemented, and the way that we use prisons as a solution to poverty. It's like, if you're poor and you're on the street, we just make it a crime to be out late at night or trespassing or loitering or sleeping outside. And then poor people who tend to be of color get swept up into the prison system and end up kind of never really being able to rejoin society. So a lot of the factors we've looked at so far are the structural factors like education, class, race, of course, all kind of mesh together to create a situation in which people of color end up being more highly incarcerated than other groups. And if you add in probation and parole, which are other large surveillance systems that a lot of people are entangled in, the number comes up to 1 in 40 US adults are under some form of correctional control or observation in the United States. So that is a huge amount of people. So this is a big kind of undiscussed problem. And I think we're told that there's a myth that we need prisons, that like without them, society will fall apart. It's very deeply ingrained in US ideology. But we're in this class, we're trying to think critically about myths that may or may not actually be true, right? So this is an invitation to start thinking about how the prison is a space where we don't take our critical skills. So here's a chart showing just how much correctional control facilities impact us as US people in the US. So we see that the justice system has control over almost 7 million people, a lot of people who are on probation. And then, you know, we have another almost 2.5 million people who are actually in correctional facilities at any given time. Now, one of the things that's really important to confront that Davis raises is the fact that prisons have not always existed, particularly not as the main form of moral enforcement in human cultures. We invented the prison at a specific time in human history because of how people's ideas about politics were changing. So we had prior forms of moral enforcement, like public shaming, putting people in the stocks, you know, whipping people or flogging people, and then just letting them rejoin society. So there was like a temporary punishment that ended, and then people were allowed to go back to society and participate. The problem with prisons, as they're currently designed, I mean, there are many problems we can talk about, but one of them is that imprisonment has now been turned into a permanent kind of second-class status, especially if you're a convicted felon in the United States. Like, you have to disclose that on job applications. Often your right to vote is taken away. You know, you have fines and fees that you have to pay constantly. And so we've made prison more permanent and therefore kind of not something you can pass through and like rejoin society. Now, what's really key to understand in the US context is that prisons did not become the main form of punishment until after we ended slavery in the United States. So there are powerful arguments from sociologists that basically the US prison system is a replacement for slavery. That, you know, it does a lot of the same things legally to people, Black people particularly, that slavery used to do, like removing their rights, removing their voting rights. And so we kind of started using prisons as part of this new political system that emerged after slavery ended, where we used to have this distinction between people who were enslaved and people who were free. And that was a racialized distinction, but then slavery ended. And so we needed a new way to politicize race. And so what we have now is people who have rights and people who do not have rights, right? People who break certain laws, their rights are removed. And this replaced that earlier distinction of free versus enslaved. Of course, now, one of the problems with this is that after slavery, there were all kinds of legal codes written that only applied to Black people. And so if you were Black, there were all kinds of laws that you could break that would put you in prison. If like a white person broke them, they wouldn't go to prison. They were called the Black codes. So right out of the gate, people of color have a different legal standard for their behavior than white people. And prisons were part of like collecting up all the Black people and institutionalizing them in a way where they couldn't compete for, like, say, the jobs what white people wanted. So we know also that incarceration has a huge impact on people's educational success, as well as if people are undereducated, they tend to be more highly incarcerated. So one of the problems is that prisons have moved away from the idea of rehabilitation, which was the original intent, toward being permanent and also permanently marginalizing people who get caught up in them. So for example, early prisons were more about offering people a space for moral contemplation. They didn't severely restrict people in the way that current prisons do. Didn't force prisoners to work for free, basically. Think about all the like unremunerated labor that happens in prisons. And early prisons, people might have to report there for some amount of time, but could often go see their families during the day. So they weren't like the kinds of like caged styles of prisons that we use today. And as late as the 1950s, even, US prisons were still offering prisoners resources and access to education. So you could actually, while you were in prison, get like your high school diploma. You could learn a trade. You could come out of prison with more skills than you went in with. And today, that is not the case anymore. Part of the crime bill in the mid 90s was about defunding the educational programs in prisons. And also, if you've been incarcerated, you often cannot get student loans anymore to go to school, to go to college. I think in some states, even if you're incarcerated, you can't get food stamps anymore. So just like booting people out of these programs that would help them maybe come out and stay out of prison because they wouldn't be poor anymore. And then, of course, poverty drives incarceration as well. The poorer you are, the more likely you are to be incarcerated. And what we see here is this idea of the prison industrial complex, which is a term that was invented to describe the way in which prisons have come to operate as profitable institutions, that they actually no longer exist to rehabilitate people. What they exist to do is to make profit off of crime. And to actually, the more laws you write saying things are crimes, right, the more people you can then arrest for breaking the law, and then you can, profit off their incarceration by like making them work very cheap or like charging them tons of money for supplies. There very recently even, I think there was a law finally passed to make this illegal, but people in prison were paying like $30 for a 10-minute phone call to their families and things like that because they were just trapped in the prison. And so they have to pay whatever the prison says to do basic things that you and I take for granted. So this term prison industrial complex gets us to think about like, what is the actual function of the prison? Like it says it's reforming people, right? But what if that's not actually the case? What if it's actually doing something else, which is like generating money for a lot of people? Davis points out that, the prison industrial complex comes from an older term called military industrial complex that was talking about how the military also seems to exist primarily to generate like contracts and profits for corporations. And so Davis says on page 88 here that both systems, meaning the military and prisons, generate huge profits for people from processes of social destruction that make people more vulnerable, such as defunding of social programs, getting rid of mental health care, high unemployment, and poor public education. That the prison is kind of like our solution for all those social problems. Like, don't fund education, just take everyone who's not able to get a job and maybe commit some low-level street crime to make money, just put them all in jail, and then you won't have to fund schools, right? So all of this is to say that the United States is deeply, deeply committed in these ways to not thinking about incarceration as a social problem and not thinking critically about whether or not prisons actually do us any good. And I think that's what Davis is kind of asking here, is like, why do we keep doing this if it's not fixing the problems? So there's a myth structure kind of propping up the prison as an idea, saying that we need the prison. So some of these ideas, right? The deepest myth prisons rely on is the idea that punishment leads to desirable social outcomes, that if you want people to do something, you have to force them through negative reinforcement, particularly. Now, this doesn't work, generally speaking. People, giving people positive incentives is far more effective than simply punishing them if they don't do what you want them to do. So this idea that punishing people will get us anywhere, or that punishment is a good solution for social problems, is a myth that really drives our reliance on the prison. And Davis is asking us to think critically about whether punishment ever leads to anything good or solves any problems. I think if we're white or we're raised middle class, we're often told this story that like prisons exist to keep us safe from them, whoever they are, right? This kind of like idea of this like bad group of people who without the prison would just run wild and you know, come for us or come for our stuff, right? So there's this kind of projection and fear that white people have of other groups, that the prison exists to kind of reassure us that these things won't happen. So we're told that they make us safe, but are they making us safe? Because one, they don't actually lower crime. There's no actual causal relationship between the level of incarceration and the crime rate in the United States. So crime seems to have a lot to do with a lot more to do with the economy than it does with the incarceration rate. So data demonstrates that they don't actually keep people from committing crimes. The threat of punishment doesn't change people's behavior. Two, prisons cost us a huge amount of money. We are funding prisons at a level way beyond what we fund education or mental health care in this country. Three, prisons are generating massive profits for privately held corporations. Like there's an incentive to create prisons, and because they're profitable, and if there's an incentive to create a prison, then there's an incentive to incarcerate people in that prison, right? So we are letting the profit margins of these corporations actually drive our legal policy. We've added something like 400 felony class crimes to the legal code in the last 30 years, so that now punishments are much harsher than they used to be, and people get into prison for much longer amounts of time for the same behaviors because it's profitable. We know that they reinforce racial and class inequality, and we're going to be talking a lot about that next week. I mean, it should be quite obvious that if, 1 in 4 Black men ends up incarcerated because their communities are so heavily policed, and then they lose their right to vote because of that, what does that do to like the Black population's voting rights, nationally? And then they also kind of substitute for social programs for the poor and mentally ill. We have basically kind of like gotten rid of mental health care facilities nationwide. That started in the 70s and proceeded through the 80s. And then we built a lot of prisons to put people who have mental health issues away and get them out of society. So we're not treating those people, we're just locking them up. And we know that incarceration is massively disruptive to families and to the social fabric, because it breaks up marriages, it keeps kids from seeing their parents, people are shipped far away from where they are, from their relatives. And it just creates a cycle of like familial breakdown that then can negatively impact the rest of the people connected to the person who's incarcerated. And it also drains families of their resources because they have to pay to see the person and drive to the prison and like pay for like send money to the person so they can eat in the prison and like make phone calls in the prison, right? So it just drains these families of all their resources. And breaks up their relationships in a way that's really, really destructive. And again, and this is a deeper ethical question, but we live in a country that says people have inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet we have an institution, the prison, that exists to take all those things away from people. So if they're inalienable, they shouldn't be able to be taken away. So what is that about? Like, that seems like a contradiction. We should investigate more deeply, like why we're permitting that. So this is a course that touches on ethics and ethical reasoning. And I think incarceration and prisons are a real ethical challenge, one of the biggest ones in our country, because we haven't had a robust public discussion about whether prisons are actually ethical in practice or theory. When you look carefully at how prisons are run and what they do and their actual effects, it gets very challenging to defend them ethically. Not only do they harm the people who are incarcerated in them, but they also produce a lot of social harm for people who are not incarcerated. So it seems like the overall impact is quite negative, and we need to be creative maybe about thinking about other things we could do that would lower crime that aren't punishment based. Another question we could ask is, do prisons produce any actual tangible social good? And if they don't, why do we accept them as a solution to social problems? And are there alternatives we're not thinking about? I mean, one thing to do is look at how other countries approach the problem of incarceration, and you'll see very different solutions and very different strategies. Again, the US has we have the largest prison population in the history of the world in the United States, like 1/4 of the world's prisoners here. So clearly we're locking a lot of people up, but we also have really high gun violence. We have high poverty rates. We have low educational quality. These things are all connected, right? So what are some possible alternatives to just punishing people that might also help solve some of those other social problems rather than making them worse, is something we can talk about. So this is all in preparation for you to complete the kind of chapter 6 of Davis for Wednesday. And then we are also watching this documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay about the history of the prison system in the United States. And it's a film that really goes deeply into racial framing and how racial framing has been used by politicians to grow and grow and grow the prison industry, particularly the racial danger frame. But I wanted to kind of give you a little background in terms of why this film is called 13th, because it's not explained, but it's a reference to the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which was passed after the Civil War to abolish slavery. And if you look at that constitutional amendment, it reads, quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States." So we get taught that slavery was abolished, but it kind of wasn't, because there's a loophole in the Constitution that allows slavery as punishment for crime. And one of the kind of operative suggestions here is that the prison system is a new form of slavery. So we can talk about what we think about that claim, right? But that's a claim that Davis and other critical race scholars are making, and sociologists of race particularly. So something to think about here is, like, I'm sure you've all been taught about the Civil War and the abolishment of slavery by Abraham Lincoln, but you may not have been taught about the accept clause in this amendment. And so I'm wondering, like, why you might not have been taught about that. Thinking about that maybe in terms of your education. And then how does knowing about it change your understanding of US history? Like, have we really moved so far away from slavery if it's still permitted in certain situations, especially if we deem something illegal and then, people do it anyway? So, because that's what creating crime is, right? It's like illegalizing things people need to do to survive. And then when they do them, you punish them and, right, put them away. So we'll talk about all of this next week, but I wanted to just give you a little framing in terms of the larger ideas here so that we're prepared to kind of engage the material. So I will leave it there, and I hope you have a good weekend.